Imagine, imagine every scientific discovery in human history. I mean, from Einstein's relativity to those, massive particle accelerators we've built underground.
Right, the whole standard model.
Exactly. Even the quantum computers we're developing right now. Just imagine all of it is completely flawless, perfectly accurate, and entirely an illusion.
Which is quite the claim to make right out of the gate.
It really is. So today on the deep dive, we are looking at a stack of incredibly dense theoretical physics papers from 2025 and 2026 that make, frankly, a staggering claim.
Yeah, it's wild stuff.
They argue that Plato writing, 2,400 years ago, didn't just write a nice philosophical metaphor about a cave.
Yeah.
He actually wrote a literal mathematical blueprint of our five-dimensional universe.
Yeah, it's a radical ontological inversion. That's the best way to describe it.
Ontological inversion. Okay, break that down.
I mean, we are talking about a mathematical framework that suggests our entire fundamental understanding of reality is just completely backward. Like, we have spent centuries perfecting the study of what this researcher calls shadows.
Wow.
While at the same time remaining completely structurally blind to the actual mechanism casting them.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. I am talking, of course, directly to you, the listener, about Plato's Allegory of the Cave. You've almost certainly heard of it, right? It's the famous thought experiment about prisoners chained in a dark cave facing this blank wall.
Right, they can't move their heads.
Yeah, they're just locked in place. And behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners there are these objects moving around. But the prisoners, they only ever see the shadows of those objects cast on the wall in front of them.
Because that's literally all they've ever known.
And exactly. They think those flat, two-dimensional shadows are the entire physical universe. That is, until one prisoner finally breaks free, turns around, is completely blinded by the fire, escapes the cave entirely, and actually looks at the real sun.
Which is an amazing visual.
It is. And for over 2 millennia, your college philosophy professor has basically told you this is just a poetic parable, right? Like a story about human ignorance and the value of education.
Which is, comforting, because it neatly categorizes this ancient text safely away from the hard empirical sciences.
Right. It's just philosophy. It's not physics.
Exactly. But the independent researcher we are focusing on today, John Surmont, he takes a completely different approach with this.
He takes it literally.
He does. In his work detailing the, let me get this right, the oscillatory dynamics transductive bridging theorem.
That is a mouth, but we'll just say ODTBT for short.
Yes, ODTBT.
Yeah.
In this framework, he argues that Plato intuitively, correctly identified the strict formal boundaries of what he calls observer-constrained projection.
So wait, are we saying Plato possessed some kind of, I don't know, advanced mathematics? Because that sounds really close to ancient aliens territory, and I want to be careful there.
No, not at all. No ancient aliens here.
Oh.
We're just saying that Plato intuitively grasped a very fundamental logical limitation of observer geometry.
Observer geometry.
Yeah. Surmont's framework basically takes the specific elements of Plato's cave and maps them one-to-one onto modern, higher-dimensional topology.
That's fascinating.
It's an exhaustive translation. He takes a 2,400-year-old story and turns it into a formalized mathematical proof of five-dimensional physics. And, I mean, if the math holds up and he argues it literally redefines E equals mc squared.
Which is mind-blowing on its own.
And on top of that,
right,
it completely overhauls our biological understanding of human consciousness itself.
Okay, we have to take this step by step because my brain is already kind of melting just thinking about it. To really understand this theory, we have to start by rebuilding the cave itself.
Right from the ground up.
But not as a classroom exercise. We have to look at it as a literal functioning physics architecture diagram. So set the stage for us. What is the actual universe in this ODTBT framework?
Okay, so in this model, what we call the universe, meaning everything you can see, touch, measure with the giant telescope, or smash together in a particle collider.
A physical stuff.
Yeah, the physical stuff. All of that is not the totality of reality. It is a severely restricted lower dimensional projection.
A projection, like a hologram.
Sort of, mathematically speaking. Surmont proposes that the true absolute universe is a five-dimensional reality. He calls this the scalar coherent substrate.
Scalar coherent substrate. All right.
Okay, and he denotes it mathematically as S5.
Okay, so 5 dimensions. Let me just ground this for a second. In our everyday lives, you and I, we move in 3 dimensions of space, right? Up, down, left, right, forward, backward.
Exactly. Spatial dimensions.
And then we move through one dimension of time. So that's basically 4 dimensions, or what physicists call a 3 plus 1D reality.
Right, our observable spacetime.
So this framework is saying there is a 5th dimension that we are just, fundamentally excluded from.
Exactly. Our 3 plus 1D observable reality I labeled O2 in his equations. So the O2 layer is the interior of the cave. The S5 substrate, the 5-dimensional bulk, that is the world outside the cave.
Okay, I'm tracking. And the specific mapping here in the papers is just wild. The framework establishes that the interior of the cave is our observable spacetime.
Right.
And the shadows on the wall are what the papers call SEUK emission events.
Yes, SEU sub K.
Which is a highly technical way of saying basically just the normal stuff we interact with.
Yeah, pretty much. It's particles, photons, the physical phenomena, and the natural forces that our standard models of physics actually measure.
Okay, so my coffee cup is an emission event.
Exactly. A photon hitting your retina, an electron spinning around a nucleus.
Yeah.
Those are quite literally the shadows on the wall. They are projection events coming from the outside.
Okay, so if the particles are the shadows, what is the fire? Because in the cave, the fire is what actually casts the shadows.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting. The fire corresponds to c, the speed of light.
The speed of light is the fire.
Yes. But not in the way we usually think about it as just a speed limit. In this geometry, c acts as the projection's resolution rate.
Resolution rate.
Yeah. It is the geometric mechanism that translates those 5-dimensional bulk dynamics into the lower dimensional spacetime that we can actually perceive.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then finally, the sun outside the cave represents the S5 scalar coherent substrate itself. It's the ultimate raw field of reality from which all observable structure actually emerges.
Let me try to visualize this with an analogy for the listener because I need a picture in my head. Is this sort of like playing a highly immersive open world 3D video game, but you're forced to play it on a completely flat 2D monitor?
That's a great way to think about it, actually.
Right, because you're exploring this world, but you have completely lost the depth dimension physically. Like, the physical monitor is flat. The world on the screen is flat. But the pixels, which are the shadows on your monitor, they're still bound by rigid, highly predictable rules.
Yes, exactly.
So the game's hidden rendering engine dictates exactly how those pixels move, even though the actual source code and, like, the 3D geometry of the graphics card are entirely hidden from the player.
That is actually a very sharp way to look at it, because what you are describing in your video game analogy is what the paper calls structural loss during projection.
Structural loss, meaning stuff gets deleted.
Basically, yeah. In Sermon's mathematical framework, there is a literal projection operator. It's a mathematical function that actively forces the 5D coherence bulk down into our observable 3D plus 1 layer.
And when it forces it down, things break.
Well, not break, but when that mathematical function executes, physical information is actively destroyed, or rather, it's stripped away.
Okay, what exactly gets stripped away in the translation?
2 really crucial things. First, the system loses its recursion depth.
Recursion depth.
Yeah. And second, phase differences are entirely compressed.
Okay, wait, stop right there. Recursion depth and phase differences. Those are some heavy jargon terms. What do they actually mean in a physical sense, like in the real world?
Okay, let's use your video game monitor analogy again, or even simpler, drawing on a piece of paper. Imagine trying to draw a 3D wireframe cube on a completely flat piece of paper.
Right, I'm with you.
To make that 3D shape fit on the flat page, you have to smash the depth dimension into those slanted diagonal lines, right?
Yeah, to give the illusion of 3D.
Exactly. But the actual physical volume, the literal space inside the cube, gets completely lost when you smash a higher dimension down into a lower one.
Oh, I see.
So that lost volume, that hidden layer of nested internal complexity, that is the recursion depth. The math literally forces the 5D universe to fold over itself, creating what we experience as flat spatial patterns.
So the shadows aren't fake.
No, the shadows you see are not illusions. A shadow of a cube is a real, measurable shape. But it is fundamentally missing the bulk of the actual object casting it.
Which honestly brings up a massive, completely obvious question. If we are the prisoners staring at the wall, if literally everything we experience is just a flattened, projected layer, what does that say about human science?
Well, it reframes it entirely.
Because, I mean, we have mapped the human genome. We've taken incredibly detailed pictures of black holes. We split the atom. Are you telling me all of that is just what, shadow reading?
In the strictest ontological sense, yes, absolutely.
Wow.
And the theory explicitly defines this. It literally labels our current scientific paradigms as shadow science.
Shadow science? That sounds almost dismissive.
It sounds that way, but to be clear, shadow science is incredibly rigorous. Remember, the prisoners in Plato's original cave were described as being extremely skilled at predicting the sequences of the shadows.
Oh, right. They had competitions and rewards for whoever was best at reading the wall.
Exactly. They developed entire science around the shadows. And that's what our quantum mechanics, our general relativity, our standard model of particle physics are. They are flawless, brilliant maps of the projected layer.
I mean, they work. That's why my DPS functions and why my microwave heats my food. We aren't just making things up.
Oh, exactly. They yield completely valid, reproducible results within the domain of the wall. But because shadow science is structurally blind to the higher dimensional bulk dynamics happening outside, we experience reality with baked-in glitches.
Right, and the theory calls these glitches encoding artifacts, which are outlined in the observer-limited projection theorem.
Yes.
And from reading the sources, this is where the theory starts answering questions that standard physics has been struggling with for literally decades.
Precisely. Because we are missing that recursion depth, because the 5D reality is compressed just to fit onto our 3D+1 monitor, the phenomena we observe naturally have bizarre, inexplicable behaviors.
Let's look at one of the specific ones. Artifact A1, temporal discontinuity.
Yes.
I read this part in the papers and it kind of blew my mind. Temporal discontinuity means events just appear suddenly, out of nowhere, without any visible cause leading up to them, like a literal glitch in the matrix.
That is exactly what happens in quantum mechanics all the time. We see particles just pop into existence out of the vacuum, or they tunnel through solid barriers inexplicably.
Or like radioactive decay, right?
Right. A radioactive atom suddenly decays at a perfectly random moment, and there's no visible trigger. Standard physics just throws its hands up and says, well, the universe at the quantum level is just fundamentally probabilistic and random.
But this ODTBT framework says it isn't random at all.
Not even a little bit. The pre-threshold accumulation of energy, basically, the buildup to the actual event, is happening in the fifth dimension.
Oh, I get it. So the pressure's building outside the cave.
Yes. We can't see the pressure building. We only see the exact moment it ruptures into our lower dimension.
Yeah.
So to us, the observers on the wall, it just looks like a sudden, completely uncaused shadow popping out of thin air.
Wow. Okay, so it's like watching a geyser erupt, right? But having absolutely no concept of underground plumbing or geological pressure. You just stare at the ground and think water magically decides to explode out of the dirt every 90 minutes.
That is the perfect analogy, yes. And that leads directly into the next glitch, artifact A2, agency attribution.
Okay, define agency attribution.
When an observing system, like a human scientist, sees directional structure or really complex movement, but cannot see the mechanical mechanism actually causing it, the human mind tends to attribute intentional agency to the phenomenon.
Oh, right. Plato explicitly noted this in the original story. He said the prisoners in the cave would anthropomorphize the shadows, assuming the shadow shapes had their own agency and were basically making their own decisions to move.
And we do the exact same thing in advanced physics and cosmology today.
We do? Like where?
Think about dark matter. When we look at the movement of galaxies, we see that there simply isn't enough visible matter to hold them together gravitationally. They should fly apart.
Right, there's missing mass.
So instead of questioning the dimensional limits of our spatial projection, we just invent invisible agencies. We call it dark matter. We can't see it, we can't measure it directly, but we assume it must be this invisible stuff acting on the galaxies.
Oh, wow.
Or think about quantum entanglement, when two particles instantly react to each other across vast distances. We struggle with the mechanism, so we anthropomorphize the math.
Spooky action at a distance.
Exactly. We are missing the mechanical cause simply because the mechanical cause exists outside the cave in the 5D bulk.
Let me hit you with one more artifact from the papers. Artifact A6, recursion depth compression.
This is a fun one.
The text says that because we lose the depth dimension, what is actually a stationary scale invariant structure in 5D looks to us like a repeating cycle in time.
Okay, think of a spiral staircase.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You look at it from the side. In full 3 dimensions, you see a static, unified structure ascending upward. Right? Just a staircase. But if you look at it strictly from above, completely compressing the depth dimension down into a flat 2D circle, all you see is a single step that seems to spin around and around in the exact same place over time.
Oh my God.
You perceive temporal recurrence, a repeating cycle, when in reality it is just a static higher dimensional structure. Sermon suggests the passage of time itself might just be an artifact of our inability to perceive the depth of the 5D bulk.
Okay, hold on. I really have to push back here for a second. This is absolutely fascinating, but it sounds like an incredibly elaborate philosophical excuse for things we just don't understand yet.
That's a fair critique.
Right, because if everything from the Large Hadron Collider to the James Webb Telescope is really just highly precise shadow reading, why should we care?
Yeah.
I mean, if the math works flawlessly in our universe, if quantum mechanics gives us the exact right answers to build microchips and lasers, why does it matter if there is a 5D bulk outside? If shadow science is perfect within the cave, why do we need to care about the sun?
And that is exactly the most common and, frankly, most vital defense of standard physics. Shut up and calculate, as the old quantum physicists used to say.
Exactly, just do the math.
So why does it matter? It matters because standard physics is reaching a terminal crisis. Shadow science is true within its domain, but it is fundamentally incomplete. And because we don't realize we are looking at compressed encoding artifacts, we hit absolute impenetrable roadblocks.
You mean like the inability to unify general relativity and quantum mechanics, like the holy grail of physics that we've been stuck on for almost a century?
Yes, exactly that. We reach a point where our math can describe what is happening with 12 decimal places of precision, but we cannot explain why it is happening.
Right, the mechanism is missing.
Shadow science cannot explain what causes the projection in the first place. It cannot explain why the fundamental constants of the universe, like the mass of an electron or the speed of light, are the exact hyperspecific numbers that they are.
They just are.
According to standard physics, yes, we can measure the shadows perfectly, but as long as we are facing the wall, we can never, ever explain the fire.
Which brings us perfectly to the most famous equation in the history of human thought. The ultimate triumph of shadow science. Albert Einstein's E equals mc squared.
The cornerstone.
To really grasp how profound this structural blindness is, we have to look at what Sermon does to this specific equation.
So let's look at how Einstein got there. Einstein derived E equals mc squared entirely from inside the cave. He relied on the symmetries of Maxwell's equations and the principle of relativity, working completely within the O2 projected layer.
Right, using the shadows.
And his mathematical derivation was absolutely perfect. He discovered that mass and energy are interchangeable, and he mapped the exact ratio between them. But, working from the inside, relying only on the shadows, he could not explain the substrate origin of Nis itself.
He knew the speed of light was the absolute speed limit of the universe, but he didn't know why the universe had a speed limit, or where that specific number, that speed, actually came from. So ODTBT basically reorganizes this equation from outside the cave, and the mapping here is just stunning. If we use the new 5D model, energy, the E in the equation, is the sun.
Yes, energy is the raw, active coherence of the scalar substrate existing completely outside the cave.
Right. Energy is the unprojected reality, and mass, the M, is the shadow.
Exactly. Mass is simply the physical form that energy is forced to take when the substrate's coherence becomes recursively locked onto the wall of our observable dimension.
So mass is just locked, flattened coherence.
That's a great way to say it.
Which means the c squared term. The speed of light squared.
Yeah.
That has to be the fire.
Yes. It is the exact geometrical conversion rate determining how the substrate's dynamics resolve into locked mass.
Wow.
What Sermon is arguing here is revolutionary.
Yeah.
He is saying that C is not a fundamental constant of the wider universe. The 5D scalar substrate, the sun, has no internal speed of light whatsoever.
Nah.
None. The metric we call C is strictly a local artifact of the projection boundary. It is the refresh rate, or the frame rate, of the specific holographic geometry that we happen to occupy.
Whoa, hold on. You're touching the third rail of physics here. Einstein proved nothing goes faster than light. I mean, the entire framework of modern astrophysics relies on Alice being an absolute universal constant. Are you telling me Einstein was wrong?
Not wrong, just incomplete. Einstein perfectly measured the exact rules of the projection.
Okay, explain that.
Think of it this way. Imagine you are inside a movie theater, and you are a scientist studying the movie playing on the screen.
Okay.
You measure the light on the screen with incredible precision, and you deduce that the universe updates its reality at exactly 24 frames per second. You write a brilliant equation proving that nothing in your reality can happen between those frames.
And I'd be right for the movie.
Exactly. You are 100% correct. Within the context of the movie screen, 24 frames per second is the absolute limit of reality. But what you don't know is that up in the projection booth, There is an entire physical world happening that isn't bound by that frame rate at all.
So Einstein perfectly measured the frame rate of the projector to figure out the mathematical relationship between the raw light bulb and the image on the screen.
Yes.
But because he was a prisoner in the theater, he was never able to turn around and see the actual film reel.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it. This framework does not demote Einstein in any way. Shadow science is real hard science. The fact that the prisoners mathematically proved E equals mc squared just by looking at shadows is an incredible testament to human genius.
It really is.
But recognizing that C is merely the mechanism of the projection, the fire, rather than the ultimate speed limit of all existence, completely changes our physical ontology. Mass is just the shadow cast by energy when it is filtered through the local speed of light.
Okay, my mind is thoroughly blown on the physics side of this. But this naturally leads to a very human question.
Which is?
If this 5D coherence bulk exists, and if it's the actual active source of all our reality, why can't we just turn our heads and look at it? Why are we chained to the wall? I mean, in Plato's original story, the prisoners are held by physical iron shackles, but in a mathematical physics framework, what is practically holding us?
In ODTBT framework, the chains are defined as epistemic constraints.
Epistemic constraints.
Specifically, they are governed by what Cymatics calls observer phase alignment, mathematically denoted as omega sub r.
Okay, let's decode that. What does phase alignment actually mean for me, a human being walking around on Earth?
You have to view yourself not just as a physical body, but as an observing system embedded within a much larger dynamic environment.
Okay.
Think of dynamical systems theory. Systems naturally settle into what are called attractor basins. They are stable states of behavior.
Give me a visual.
Think of a marble rolling around the edge of a bowl. Eventually, gravity pulls it down to the bottom of the bowl, and it settles there. It stays there. That bottom point is the attractor basin.
Got it.
In this framework, our 3 plus 1D observable reality is just a very deep, very stable attractor basin.
And my phase alignment, my omega sub r, is basically my specific frequency that locks me into the specific bowl.
Exactly. If your internal phase alignment is tuned to the lowest attractor basin, you are structurally, mathematically incapable of processing the higher 5D state. You are chained to the geometry of the wall.
So how does a prisoner break the chains? How do you get out of the bowl?
Well, you can't just gradually roll the marble up the side. The journey out of the cave is not a smooth, linear process.
I can't just inch my way out.
No. You cannot just study harder or slowly improve your shadow reading physics until the 5D universe gently fades into view. That's not how it works. To break the lock, the observing system has to accumulate sufficient phase strain.
Phase strain, like shaking the table that the bowl is sitting on.
Good analogy. You are introducing thermodynamic and informational friction into the system until it hits a breaking point. You have to push the system past a critical threshold. And when you finally cross that threshold, it triggers a massive event that the framework calls a twist bifurcation.
TWIST. The threshold waveform interface for state transformation. What does a bifurcation actually look like in practice?
In mathematics, a bifurcation is a sudden, qualitative change in a system's behavior when a parameter crosses a critical value. Let's look at water boiling.
Okay.
The water in a kettle is liquid, and it's getting hotter and hotter. That's accumulating phase strain. Then, at exactly 100 degrees Celsius, it doesn't just get a little hotter. It undergoes a complete phase transition and violently boils into steam. It bifurcates into a totally new state.
Oh, I see.
The papers describe the twist bifurcation as a mathematically violent, discontinuous phase transition. It forcefully reorganizes the entire coherence field of the observer and violently ejects them into a completely new, higher attractor basin.
Wait, so I can't just learn my way out of the cave. My actual physical perceptual structure has to undergo a completely destabilizing violent phase shift to see the sun.
Yes. The geometry of your reality literally collapses and resets. And think about how perfectly this aligns with Plato's narrative again.
Oh, right.
When the prisoner is finally freed and forced to turn around, Plato doesn't describe it as some pleasant, peaceful aha moment of enlightenment. He explicitly describes the freed prisoner experiencing intense physical pain, blinding light, and utter disorientation.
Right. The prisoner actually wants to turn back to the shadows because the true light literally hurts.
From a systems perspective, an observer who is perfectly tuned to one coherence attractor will experience the geometry of a higher attractor basin as deeply toxic and destabilizing.
Because their system isn't built for it.
Exactly. Your old shadow reading skills, your spatial reasoning, your concept of linear time, they're completely useless in the light of the new basin. You have to rebuild your perceptual skills from scratch while being bombarded by raw 5D coherence.
That is terrifying and honestly exhilarating all at once. It makes enlightenment sound less like sitting peacefully on a mountaintop and more like surviving a controlled demolition of your own mind.
It really does.
Which perfectly segues into the next major leap in these papers. Because this framework doesn't just apply to theoretical physicists looking at the cosmos through a telescope. Cymatics takes this entire ODTBT projection architecture, the twist bifurcation, the attractor basins, and he applies it directly to our own biology.
This is where it gets incredibly personal.
It really does. What if the cave isn't just out there in deep space? What if the cave is literally inside our heads?
This is where the theory brilliantly bridges cosmology and neuroscience. The second major paper we are looking at is titled Thermodynamic Fluctuation, Recursive Coherence, and the Twist of Consciousness.
Quite the title.
And it completely dismantles our standard medical view of the brain. You see, standard computational neuroscience treats consciousness as a strictly localized product of the brain. The prevailing theory is that the brain is essentially a wet meat computer.
Right. Neurons fire in these highly complex algorithmic patterns, data is processed, and then somehow, magically, out of that computational crunching, you experience the subjective feeling of being alive. You experience the color red or the taste of coffee.
But standard neuroscience has completely failed to explain how that happens. It's famous in philosophy. It's called the hard problem of consciousness.
Right. How do you get subjective feeling from dead matter?
Exactly. But Cymatics sidesteps the computer analogy entirely. He argues that consciousness is not a computational product at all. Consciousness is the literal phase state of a recursive coherence field, operating across multiple biological scales simultaneously.
Okay, but recursive coherence field, we need to unpack that entirely. He starts at the absolute smallest biological level, right? Molecules, specifically proteins.
Yes, proteins.
The papers talk about proteins acting as molecular gatekeepers. Now, I learned in high school biology that proteins are just static building blocks, like, biological Lego bricks.
That is a very outdated view, actually. Proteins are highly dynamic. They undergo continuous conformational fluctuations.
Meaning they move?
Meaning they are constantly wiggling, folding, and rapidly changing their 3D shape based on the thermal noise and ambient heat energy of their local cellular environment.
Wow. Okay.
Now, standard biology views this thermal wiggling as a nuisance. It's just random thermodynamic noise in the background. But Cymatics completely flips this. He calls these fluctuating proteins recursive holons.
So the wiggling isn't just random noise, it's purposeful.
Think of a protein folding under thermal noise, not as a random jiggle, but as a complex, microscopic lock that is constantly fluidly changing its internal shape, actively searching for a specific energetic key.
Oh, I love that. And it goes even deeper than the proteins, right? Because the papers discuss thermoquibits. What on earth is a biological quibit?
A qubit is a basic unit of quantum information. The paper suggests that embedded deep within specific structures in our cells, like microtubules or certain electron spin systems, there are quantum units that sit right on the razor's edge between quantum mechanics and classical physics.
Right on the boundary?
Yes.
Yeah.
These thermoquibits interact with the fluctuating proteins to create a subquantum coherence layer. These are the microscopic foundational starting points of your phase alignment.
And this changes the entire definition of entropy in biology. I mean, we usually hear the word entropy and we think of like the inevitable heat death of the universe or just statistical disorder. My messy bedroom is entropic.
Right, standard disorder.
But in this biological framework, entropy is a phase topological metric. It's a literal physical indicator of recursive strain or misalignment in the brain's overall oscillatory structure.
Exactly. Entropy is the measurement of the orchestra falling out of tune.
Yes. Let's expand on that analogy because it really helped me grasp this when I was reading. If my brain isn't a biological computer crunching code, it is more like an incredibly massive nested set of tuning forks.
Very nested.
Starting from the tiny little Thermoquibits, up to the folding proteins, up to the individual neurons, all the way up to the massive neural networks spanning the hemispheres of my brain. And all of these tuning forks are constantly vibrating, trying to maintain acoustic, resonant harmony with each other.
And entropy is the physical measurement of the strain when those tuning forks start vibrating out of phase. when they clash.
And a computer doesn't care if it's out of tune, right? It just keeps processing ones and zeros until a literal wire breaks. But a resonant acoustic system, like our nested tuning forks, it can hit a breaking point.
Which is exactly why this model solves mysteries that standard neuroscience simply cannot touch. The Mead computer model struggles deeply to explain spontaneous, systemic shifts in global consciousness.
Shifts like what?
Think about the everyday act of falling into deep, dreamless sleep, or going under chemical anesthesia, or experiencing trauma dissociation, or even a monk dropping into a deep meditative trance. A standard computer doesn't naturally undergo spontaneous global state shifts like that.
It just crashes. But a system of tuning forks can hit a twist threshold.
Precisely. Viewing the brain as a recursive coherence geometry explains these conscious states flawlessly. These dramatic shifts in our lived experience are quite literally twist bifurcations.
So sleep is a bifurcation.
Yes. When the brain accumulates too much entropic phase strain, when the biological orchestra gets too out of tune with the underlying coherence field, the system reaches a critical limit. The coherence field either violently collapses or it forcefully reorganizes into a new attractor basin.
You shift basins.
You shift basins, you lose consciousness, you fall asleep, or you dissociate.
So if my consciousness is really all about maintaining or breaking this physical coherence alignment, is there a biological equivalent to the chains in Plato's cave? Like, are there actual physical structures in human neuroanatomy that are holding me in this specific reality?
Yes, there are. The research points directly to specific gating mechanisms deep in the human brainstem. It highlights the median raphe nucleus, the interpeduncular nucleus, and a really mysterious thin sheet of neurons called the claustrum.
The claustrum. Wait, didn't Francis Crick, the guy who co-discovered DNA, didn't he spend the end of his life basically obsessing over the claustrum?
He did. He famously theorized that the claustrum was the conductor of consciousness, effectively the physiological seat of the soul. In Sermon's framework, these specific brainstem regions act as the biological twist regulators. They are the physical chains holding us in the cave.
How do they chain us, though? What do they actually do physically?
They function by suppressing or gating our recursive readiness. By constantly modulating specific neurotransmitters like serotonin and acetylcholine, these structures can actively inhibit phase entrainment.
They keep the tuning forks clamped down?
Exactly. This prevents the system from accumulating too much phase strain, which keeps us firmly, safely locked in the standard waking 3+1D reality basin.
So they keep us from bifurcating constantly.
Right, because if they loosen their grip, they can induce slow-wave sleep or dissociative states. Or, if they fail entirely, they can trigger massive, large-scale coherence resets, like a seizure, or a profound psychedelic ego-death experience.
Wow.
They are the physiological shackles holding our omega sub-R phase alignment steady so we can actually function and survive in this specific evolutionary environment.
But here's where it gets incredibly practical and, frankly, super helpful. The sources don't just leave this as some abstract theory about brain anatomy. They say we can actually mess with those biological chains. We can hack them.
Yes, through what they call entrainment therapies.
Right. The text discusses things like neurofeedback, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or rTMS, and even ancient auditory practices like listening to singing bowl sound meditation. The papers claim these therapies work by introducing highly specific external rhythms that physically stabilize our internal phase structures.
They realign our recursive coherence. Let's break down exactly how that works, because it so beautifully bridges ancient wisdom with cutting-edge physics.
Let's do it.
When a singing bowl is struck, it produces a very pure, resonant acoustic frequency. When that sound wave enters your ear, it is transduced into an electrical signal. That electrical rhythm propagates all the way through your brain's nested layers.
Through all the tuning forks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the external frequency is highly coherent, it acts like a master tuning fork, naturally coaxing your out-of-phase proteins and neural networks back into proper alignment. It physically reduces the entropic strain in your brain.
Are you seriously saying that when someone sits in a room listening to a singing bowl meditation, or when a patient goes to a clinic to get targeted magnetic brain stimulation to treat severe depression, they are quite literally adjusting the omega sub-R phase alignment of their biological chains to stave off a mathematical twist collapse?
That is exactly what this framework asserts.
Mhm.
And it carries profound philosophical and medical implications. I mean, for the last 400 years, basically since Descartes, Western science has treated the mind and the body as a strict dualism.
Right, ghost in the machine.
You have the software, the mind, and the hardware, the brain. But in ODTBT, mind and matter are not separate things at all. The paper states they are reciprocally transductive.
Okay, translate reciprocally transductive for me, meaning
Brainy.
they translate into each other. Like a speaker turning electrical signals into sound waves and a microphone turning sound waves back into electricity.
That is the perfect analogy. Your consciousness isn't just a passive ghost watching the physical brain react. And your brain isn't just a machine producing thoughts. Your conscious intent, your literal focus, your attention, can physically alter the geometric coherence of your cellular structure.
That's incredible.
And conversely, the physical manipulation of your cells via magnets or sound waves can physically rewrite your subjective consciousness. Healing, sudden insight, recovering from deep trauma.
Yeah.
These aren't just invisible chemical cascades happening in the background.
They are literal, physical, geometric reorganizations of your connection to the five-dimensional universe.
Exactly. You, as a conscious entity, are a transductive node embedded within a massive cosmological coherent substrate. When you use sound or magnetic fields or deep meditation to heal, you are smoothing out the entropic strain in your nested HoloLens. You are actively tuning your personal connection to the 5D bulk.
I have to say, this is genuinely one of the most beautiful, unified theories of reality I have ever encountered. It connects the absolute origins of the cosmos to the microscopic proteins wiggling inside my brainstem.
It's breathtaking in its scope.
But I have to ask the hard, cynical question.
Bring it on.
How on earth do we prove it? I mean, this sounds amazing on paper. It makes mathematical sense. But how do you experimentally test a five-dimensional theory from inside a three-dimensional cave? If we are chained to the wall, how do we scientifically prove the sun is real?
That is the big question. But Cymatics doesn't leave us hanging. He doesn't just offer beautiful philosophy. He offers a strictly testable hypothesis.
Okay, what is it?
The third paper in the stack explicitly outlines a real-world laboratory experimental testing protocol using cymatics, specifically an advanced variation of the Chladni plate experiment.
Okay, for those listening who might not have spent a lot of time in a university acoustics lab, a Chladni plate is a classic physics demonstration. Usually it's a flat metal plate like brass covered in a really thin layer of fine sand.
Right.
And underneath the plate is an acoustic transducer, which is basically just a powerful speaker. When you play a sound wave, specific resonant frequency, through the speaker, the metal plate vibrates. And as it vibrates, the sand sort of magically dances and forms these incredibly complex, perfectly geometric patterns on the surface of the metal.
It is a beautiful visual demonstration of standing waves. And in the context of ODTBT, Cymatics proposes using this Chladni plate as a controlled miniature cave. We can map the entire 5D projection framework onto this simple physical setup.
Okay, let's build the lab experiment right here. What represents what?
The acoustic field vibrating within the metal plate itself, the raw energy moving invisibly through the structure that represents the S5 substrate. It is the hidden, deeper reality of the system.
Okay, and the fire.
The driving resonant frequency that we pump out of the speaker acts as the fire, or C. It is the projection mechanism locking the energy into form.
Which means the sand.
The geometric sand patterns that become visible to our eyes on the surface, those are the shadows, the SEUK events, the observable physical mass.
So a normal Chladni plate experiment just shows us standard physics. It just shows us how shadows behave on a 2D surface. How do we use it to prove a hidden fifth dimension?
Cymatics suggests applying what he calls non-Maxwellian coherence-gated driving protocols.
Meaning, we hack the fire.
Exactly. Normally, when you vibrate a Chladni plate with a single tone, you are acting as a prisoner. You're applying a simple, continuous frequency, and you just watch the 2D shadow form without any access to the full, complex, coherent state of the acoustics.
You just get a pretty picture.
Right. But what if we don't use a single simple tone? What if we use multiple intersecting phased arrays? What if we manipulate the drive artificially by feeding the plate highly specific, complex phase information that corresponds mathematically to a five-dimensional structural configuration?
Wait, we feed the speaker the math of the fifth dimension. We are effectively reaching into the projection booth and messing with the film reel.
Yes. By applying this coherence-gated driving protocol, you are forcing the plate to vibrate in a way that does not naturally fit the geometry of its flat 2D surface. You are actively forcing it to process higher dimensional strain.
And what does the theory predict will actually happen to the sand? Will it just turn into a chaotic mess?
No, and that is the absolutely brilliant part. The prediction is that if the ODTBT framework is correct, we will observe definitive mode selection bias.
Mode selection bias.
The sand will not just form random noise, nor will it form standard 2D standing waves. Specific vibrational channels, what the paper identifies as the singlet and triplet channels, will be selectively preferentially activated. The sand patterns will be forced to display the structural signature of the underlying higher dimensional substrate.
Oh my God. We will literally see the 5D geometry encoded as a visible anomaly in the 2D sand.
Exactly. We will have forced the shadows to glitch in a perfectly predictable, mathematically sound way, proving the existence of the complex object casting them.
That is unbelievable. And I mean, if that experiment works, it changes everything.
It raises an urgent, truly defining question about the entire future of our scientific endeavor. As humans,